Nighttime on still waters. This is NB 506812, narrowcasting into the night from somewhere on Britain's waterways. 23rd of January, Thursday. A robin one winter, riding out a sleety squall on the flailing branch of pyracantha fire. He often springs to mind when squalls hit, and my world lurches fearfully beneath me. I wish for his poise, and his ability to find and surf upon the still point of chaos. It's been a day of sunshine and blue skies, but even though it felt warm in the sun, the dawn frost still lay white and cold in the shadowed places. And now that night has fallen, the frost once more stretches out like a cat uncurling from its sleep. A thin haze softens the stars and shuffles the constellations around. And a light wind stirs along the towpath, rustling the dead leaves with its cold breath. This is the narrowboat Erica, narrowcasting into the darkness of a chilly late January night. To you, wherever you are. It's so lovely to see you. I was really hoping that you could make it tonight. So come in. Out of the chill and make yourself comfortable by the stove. The kettle's just boiled, the biscuit barrel has been restocked, and the night awaits us. Welcome aboard. Well, I don't know how things are with you, but from my experience recently, it certainly appears that we're living in interesting times. There's a lot going on, isn't there? And the weather swings in moods. And even just these past couple of weeks, we've had a taste of, well, almost all the seasons. The skies build and then clear. The ground glitters with frost and then softens to a waterlogged porridge. And every day, it feels different. A really low pressure system that was not only nearing record level, but which also intensified at a staggeringly rapid rate, brought in Storm Aowen. We were relatively sheltered here, and although it got very blustery, we missed some of the worst effects experienced by those to the north and south of us. I think this might partly have been due to its tracking, but also we are screened a little more from westerly winds. For example, the northeasterly winds of Storm Dara at the beginning of last December wrought much more damage here, bringing down a number of the local trees. And this week also brought some sad news. The last remaining cygnet died this week. I had been concerned about her for a while, and over the last couple of days she appeared to crave human company, climbing into boats, sleeping at night in the sterns and well decks of a couple of our neighbouring friends. And Wednesday night I caught sight of her, halfway up the canal bank. She'd been trying to get out onto the grass, but so exhausted she just lay there and had hooked her neck over one of the older saplings to stop her sliding back into the water where she would have undoubtedly have drowned. She was too weak to hold her head up. And she was also losing blood, but I couldn't see from where. She was still aware of her surroundings, but clearly in a very weakened state. And she let me gently unwrap her from the alder branch and lift her to a quiet, safe spot onto the grass. And there she tucked her head under her wing and nestled down, We sat for a while together in a night of gathering mist that slowly quenched the stars from the sky. We both, I felt, intuitively knew that this was the time for her to leave, as she so naturally, it seemed, found that one final stream she needed to swim down. There was no struggle, just a quiet sense of letting go. And so much of it resonated so strongly with this time last year, when Dad was dying. That quiet, almost peaceful feel. But I hadn't expected to be so blindsided by the emotions it evoked. Why was it, this midwifing of a young swan into her death, so much harder than with Dad? Why did this time cut me so viscerally deep? And what did it say about my relationship with Dad and with the swan? But of course it's never really as simple as that. That visceral wound, that overwhelming tsunami of emotions that hit me as I stroked the soft down of her neck that was never to know the pure white of adult plumage, or the rush of wind and the wing song in flight. It was all as much about Dad's dying as it was for this little swan. For our lives are not filled with this linear succession of disparate and disconnected events, but instead they comprise of an interconnected tapestry, an ecology of events woven together so that their threads become indistinguishable. Each event and experience connected and inherent in the other, in the oneness of our living. And this short time, sitting with the Cygnet as she slipped away from the world, created a space, an experience that allowed me to acknowledge feelings and process emotions that were just not possible at the time. An unlocking of hidden locks. A shepherding into the pastures of grief that were always there, but I guess sometimes unrecognized. A circling back to help complete, or at least to move a little more towards completeness, the task still to be finished. It was an opportunity for me to see things that I wasn't able to see at the time, to visit emotions and loss that I just wasn't open to or unable or perhaps just not ready to experience at the time. And not even with just Dad, but with Mum's loss too, and all the other losses that I've experienced through my life. And there's also a strange and fitting congruity about Dad's death and the death of this young swan that, well, at the moment anyway, I can't quite put my finger on. But I'm fairly certain that Dad would understand and approve. However, this week also brought some much happier news. Linda, who might be known better to listeners as Orange Cookie, sent me a beautiful tea towel that she had designed, having been inspired by this podcast. It's called Still Waters and Nighttime Bats, and it's wonderful. And what makes it even more special is that the abstract-looking background is actually sonograms of the calls of pipistrelle bats. And I love the design, and it captures the feelings that I want to create in the podcast so perfectly. It's beautiful, Linda. Thank you. And it's far too good to put to use. And Donna's working on framing it so that we can display it here in the Erica. And Linda, or Orange Cookie, has a number of really wonderful designs, many of which feature narrowboats or are canal-based. And you can see them in her online shop on Spoonflower. And I'm going to put the link to it in the program notes. but I'll also add a photograph of the tea towel to the episodes page on the NOSW Pod website. I love hearing from you, and thank you for reaching out and contacting me. And it was lovely to hear from Jenny, who used the contact form on the NOSW Pod website. Thank you very much for your really kind words. And I am so glad that you've been enjoying the podcast and finding it useful. And there's always a place for you here, Jenny. And in the last episode, I said hello to NASA7722 and to Rebecca Cook over on YouTube. I know that you won't have heard it, and I'm going to explain all of this in much greater detail in a little while. But thank you both, and I really appreciate your comments there. Hello also to Lee. Thank you for your emails. And you mentioned the Wallace and Gromit film, Vengeance Most Foul. It sounds brilliant. We've not seen it yet, but a lot of our boaty friends and neighbours have, and it caused great hilarity and excitement here when it was first shown, particularly executing a handbrake turn in an arrowboat. It does look great, and hopefully we'll get round to seeing it sometime soon. And hello to Anna McKellar, and to Mind Shambles, and also to JB on Mastodon. And also quick hellos to Jason Polite, Sherry Rausch, Captain Bugwash, Kaz, Andrea Hansen, Tracy Thomas. Tracy, I'm still keeping my eyes open and fingers crossed for the Kingfishers. I haven't given up hope yet. Also to Rachel Eglinton, Rosario Aquera Martin, Captain Arlo, Deb Moon Mountford, Christine Hamill, Louise Lambert, and, of course, LJ and Bodie. Hi to you both. It's also a great delight to welcome Kevin Bailey to our merry band of Lockwheelers. Kevin, welcome and thank you. And thank you to all of our Lockwheelers for continuing to support this podcast. It is always greatly appreciated. They are Kevin B., Fleur and David Mcloughlin, Lois Raphael, Sami Walbury, Tania Yorgey, Andrea Hansen, Chris Hinds, David Dirom, Chris and Alan on the narrowboat The Land of Green Ginger, Captain Arlo, Rebecca Russell, Alison on the narrowboat Mucker, Derek and Pauline on Silver Fox, Anna V, Orange Cookie, Mary Keane, Tony Rutherford, Arabella Holtzapfel, Rory with MJ and Kayla, the narrowboat Precious Jet, Linda Reynolds Birkins, Richard Noble, Carol Ferguson, Tracy Thomas, Mark and Tricia Stowe, and Madeline Smith. Thank you. The world and all the life continues to flow around us, following the movements of their own cycles and rhythms, the swells and ebbs of their breathings. Above us, the January moon sharpens to a crescent, until soon, in the coming days, it'll be pared away to a fingernail of light, until once more it sinks back within the darkness of its new birth. Or it would be if it wasn't for this moment below the horizon. And the wheel of seasons slowly turns. In a week or two's time it'll be Imbolc, the Celtic New Year, the return of the light, the signalling march of spring's return, and the sun's progressively climbing arc over our heads. And the sheep in the fields are getting plumper with lamb, and the rooks roister around their rookeries. The drake mallards are already looking resplendent. The metallic green of their head feathers shines glossily bright, and the adolescents, all suited and booted and nowhere to go, strut and squabble. and the sap is on the rise. We share this earth with so many complex rhythms and flux and flows. And they're all different, marching to a beat, unheard and unrecognized by others, but melding together as one mesmerizing, helical dance of our journeys through the world. The world of the heron might be completely alien and even unknowable to me. And I might be deaf and blind to the routines and patterns of his life and the impulses that prompt him. But I do know this. We will share together the same sunrises, the same sharp showers that sting the water's surface into a frenzy of bubbles. We will feel the same winds that cut across the fields, and we will sense the same warmth of sun on our bodies. We will stand and watch the same sun drop behind the trees on the skyline in the west. And this is the truth of our lives, that we are all in motion, and we are part of that great, breathtaking murmuration that is life. Movement and change is everywhere. There is no still point in a river. Our very state of being is woven upon the loom of change, movement, transience. We do have an inbuilt expectation of change, although we tend to call it other things. And if it wasn't there, it feels odd, wrong, dead, lifeless, for life itself seems to be predicated on being transient. Change then seems to be as much our natural state as it is the rivers or the skies, and yet it can also be so hard. It seems to be a perennial question of this podcast, one that I return to time and time again. If change is so much part of our life, inherent to it, why is dealing with it sometimes so difficult? Because it's not always easy, is it? Facing these changes that come, especially those that seem so destructive, inflicting pain or hurt or loss. And change, almost by definition, includes some element of loss and the leaving. But with some changes, perhaps most of them, the encounter of the new brings benefits. The gains outweigh the loss, so we don't even think about what's now gone. But other changes hurt, and that sting of loss can ferment complex and sometimes powerful emotions. And at these times, it's difficult to feel grounded, at peace, or even just how to cope. And I don't know if it's just me, but there seems to be such a lot of changes happening recently, globally and locally, and some with far-reaching consequences. The loss of a young swan, and trees whose presence and shapes have imprinted themselves onto my life, and who have shaded and sheltered me, gone. An old field in which I used to watch rabbits and rooks, torn up for development. Changes that sometimes I feel at a loss to know how to properly deal with. And even this podcast is not exempt from the movement of change, as perhaps you might already have noticed. And I find managing these changes particularly difficult. The very heart of the podcast is its, I don't know, familiarity, its dependability. That in all the chaos of movement and change, here is some place quiet, reliable, dependable, safe. And for me, one of its main strengths is that, by and large, it has not materially changed that much since episode 1. Things have changed, of course, but they tend to be small. The main elements are pretty much the same as those found in that very first recording, Duck Calls in the Night. And this is partly because I like the format, and I think, for me, it works. And initially, as I was starting, I did have some ideas that would align it more closely with the more expected format of podcasts. However, I'm also aware that as the listenership has developed, and as I've got to know how it's often used and listened to, that it's that predictability, for want of a better word, that a lot of listeners find useful. There is comfort, particularly in a podcast like this that aims to create something familiar, secure in a world that feels incomprehensible at times and alien. However, at long last, a change has come, and it's one that I've been battling with for, well over 3 years. Actually, almost before it started. Something that's grown, I guess, almost into a hallmark of each episode is the theme music. Saint-Saëns' The Swan. In fact, the outro embedded under the reading from that night's weather log has been one of the most commented features of this podcast, almost from its inception. Even if some of those who comment are not quite sure what the music was. And when I was putting the podcast together, I actually had in mind a very different piece of music. It was a lilting, bluesy jazz saxophone type thing, and it seemed to work quite well. But then I came across that old recording of Saint-Saëns, and it seemed to fit so perfectly. But the problem is that the use of published music on podcasts is a really fraught area. More than one group and organization who support and offer guidance to podcasts simply state, unless it's your own or composed and performed for you alone, simply don't use music on your podcasts. Legally, it's just too difficult. However, other guidance was a little bit more detailed, and there are times when you can use music without getting into trouble with the composers, the artists, the recording companies, as well as the licensing authorities who monitor and police sort of unofficial broadcasts of music. The recording that I used came from a library and had labelled it under the Creative Commons license. In other words, it was in public domain. And this meant that as long as I was not using it for commercial gain or materially altering it, which I wasn't, it was available for use to people just like me. Actually, in all honesty, I was aware that this was open to challenge. But as at the time I was expecting no more than 20 to 30 people, and them family and friends listening to the podcast, I didn't really look any deeper. And the Swan seems over the time to now have become so inherent to the podcast's identity that I've really been extremely loath to replace it. It sets the tone for the podcast, the atmosphere of it so beautifully and perfectly. However, over the years, as the listenership rose into the hundreds, and then the thousands, and then into the tens of thousands, that nagging worry about the legality of its use kept raising its head. Now, because it's old, both the recording and Saint-Saëns itself is now technically out of copyright and in the public domain. However, some of his work is still held under license. And the move from Google Podcasts to YouTube, that's much more integrated with the music licensing bodies, as well as anti-pirating schemes, has sort of moved things to a head. Their notifications have pretty consistently informed me that although there's no breach of copyright, because the music is licensed, they block it from particular countries and territories. They also means that I can't monetize from them, but I have no intention of doing so, so that didn't really affect me. However, the list of countries has been growing, as well as my unease with using the theme, and can now include the US, Canada, UK, and Australasia, as well as hundreds of other countries and territories. And this is why the YouTube episodes might appear a little sporadic, and why if you compare the episodes listed on YouTube with those on the NOS Pod website, you will find that there are fewer, or there are gaps in them. And it's also why the last episode, Wrapped in Freezing Fog, is not appearing on the YouTube channel. Now, I think I spotted why the blocking seems to be so inconsistent, affecting some episodes and not others. And I might have a system to work around it. However, I'm just not into playing the system. And so there are two solutions: that I create two recordings, one for the podcast directories and one for YouTube, with the intro and outro removed. The incidental music's fine, because that's created for me specifically by Helen. However, this still doesn't address that ethical question of using another person's work without their consent or license, even though they're dead. I tried to see if I could get a license to use the Swan. However, this rapidly turned into a legal nightmare, and it became apparent that even for a very small, non-commercial podcast like this, tracking down the right license holders can, first of all, be extremely difficult, and it would also involve buying not one license, but a minimum of 3 from different bodies. I would also need to register the podcast with Company House to become legally and HMRC recognized and accountable business, as well as applying to get the podcast recognized as a not-for-profit business, if I wanted to avoid paying the premium price for a PPL or PRS license that allows me to broadcast to the public. Plus, the onus would be on me that I had gained consent of all parties involved, which is not always clear who they are or where and how to contact them. My most optimistic estimates could see the costs running into about £1,000 per year, but it could easily rise to be a lot more, particularly if I couldn't prove that I was a not-for-profit company. The other alternative was to simply not have a theme. And I have played around with this option, particularly for YouTube. But especially the weather log just felt flat with no music underneath it, and it lost a lot of its soothing quality. And Helen's music's great, and it fits well with the internal sequencing, but it didn't quite flow with either the intro or the outro. And I spent a lot of time looking through agencies and libraries that provide music for podcasts, videos, etc. The problem there is that you have to be careful. So YouTube, for example, have a great and really extensive library of music, but you can only use them on YouTube, which is fine for vloggers, but not for podcasts that are shared on multiple platforms. However, following a recommendation, I eventually did run to earth a library that offers what I've really been looking for, and I spent quite a long time going through the different tracks. it's licensed, or certainly it seems to be licensed to be used across all platforms, podcast as well as YouTube and Spotify. And I've found a piece of music that I think fits quite well with this podcast. In fact, it's a lovely piece by a Ukrainian musician, Oleksiy Kalina, called Crying Cello. And although I will miss the swan, I also quite like the idea that another small artist is going to get a bit of support from this. And so the changes that come can often feel thrust upon us, difficult, so unwelcome, sometimes even so destructive. And we would be fools to pretend that sometimes they're not all of those things. But change, no matter how difficult we might find it, is part of that natural flow of life. The rivers flow. The night sky tilts and circles above our heads. The cycles of the seasons match the ebb and flooding of the tides. The robin on the flailing pyracantha branch in the midst of a sleety squall might not relish the storm's icy bite, but nevertheless surfs that bucking twig with a quiet poise of a champion surfer. These changes that come upon us can either overwhelm us or become the wave that supports us. To find the stillness, the balance within the flow of movement. To regain our balance in the tilt of change and find the still point amid the chaos. For so long I resisted this way of thinking. It seemed too much like passively accepting fatalism. And yet, it's the opposite of passive. It's active. And not only that, but is a creative outburst. Creating wonderful new things and meanings. Transforming apparent obstacles and hurts into new paths, through which we encounter new songs, new sunrises, new dances, new experiences. Learning to find balance and ride these sometimes catastrophic cataracts that we meet during our lives is deeply embedded within a lot of Eastern ideas and philosophies. This emphasis of not battling against the situation that we find ourselves in, or trying through brute willpower to change it to serve our own purposes. It's about adaptability. And I love these words of K.T. Murano in his book, The Monk and the Butterfly. Adaptability in Zen is understood as the capacity to flow with life's changes, with grace and ease. To stand resilient in the face of adversity, and to embrace the transient nature of all things without attachment or resistance. It is a dance with the unpredictable, a harmonious alignment with the Tao, the way of the universe which moves and changes in patterns beyond our comprehension. True adaptability is not a passive surrender to the whims of fate, but an active engagement with the present moment, a readiness to meet each situation with a clear mind and an open heart. This is the Narrowboat Erica, signing off for the night and wishing you a very restful and peaceful night. Good night. Temperature outside minus 0.7 degrees. Inside 22 degrees. Humidity 96%. Dew point 0 degrees. Wind direction south. Wind strength 6 miles per hour. Barometric pressure 1006.4 rising. Cloud cover 76%. Cloud ceiling 10,100 feet. Precipitation 0.51 millimeters. Moon phase 14.4% waning crescent. Day length 8 hours 44 minutes. Sunset 16:41. Sky casting 7:57.